Welcome to Conspiracist.
Today, we're tackling a really fascinating and, often debated idea.
That's right. It's the hypothesis that there might be an intentional concealment, specifically by governments, of evidence relating to, what's called a quantum consciousness conspiracy.
The core idea here is that there's this deliberate effort to suppress the understanding that our consciousness actually operates at a quantum level.
Which, if true, could have just massive implications for how we see everything, reality, ourselves, the universe.
Absolutely. So the question is, are we maybe on the brink of some quantum revolution in understanding consciousness?
And, crucially for this deep dive, is someone trying to keep that under wraps.
So in this discussion, we're going to explore the main claims behind this hypothesis.
We'll be looking at discussions, arguments from various online forums, some academic perspectives too, on consciousness, quantum mechanics, and where they might intersect.
Yeah, and our goal here is really objectivity. We want to evaluate the reasoning, the supposed evidence, without taking sides, without speculating beyond what people are actually discussing.
Right. We're trying to understand the basis for these claims and also why they provoke such strong reactions, both for and against.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, this term quantum consciousness. What are we actually talking about?
At its most basic, the general idea floating around is that consciousness isn't just brain cells firing in the classical sense. It might be fundamentally linked to, or maybe even arise from, quantum phenomena.
Which would be a pretty big shift from the standard view, the sort of classical materialistic perspective, where consciousness is seen purely as a product of large-scale neuronal activity.
So where does quantum mechanics actually come into the picture when people talk about the brain? I've heard the observer effect mentioned quite a bit.
Yes, the observer effect. It's a cornerstone of quantum mechanics. The idea that simply observing or measuring a quantum system seems to affect its state.
And how does that connect to consciousness?
Well, some interpretations, going back quite a way actually to von Neumann and Wigner, they suggested that maybe consciousness itself plays a role in collapsing the wave function.
The wave function, that's the sort of cloud of possibilities before measurement.
Exactly. The probabilistic description. The idea was maybe consciousness is what makes reality snap into a definite state upon observation. It's an intriguing idea.
So the possibility is that consciousness isn't just about the big picture of neurons, but maybe tiny quantum events happening within them.
That's the core suggestion, yeah. But, the really big question, the sticking point, is whether these incredibly small, delicate quantum effects could realistically scale up.
Scale up to create something as complex and robust as our everyday subjective experience.
Precisely. It seems like a huge jump in scale.
Are there more specific theories trying to bridge that gap? How might this quantum stuff actually work inside brain cells?
Well, one of the most well-known theories is ORCHOR. That stands for Orchestrated Objective Reduction. It was proposed by Sir Roger Penrose, the physicist, and Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist.
Interesting combination.
Yeah, and their theory focuses on microtubules. These are tiny protein structures, sort of the skeleton inside neurons.
Right, I've heard of those.
They propose that tubulins, the protein subunits making up microtubules, can exist in a state of quantum superposition.
Meaning they can be in multiple states at once, like the classic quantum weirdness.
Exactly. And they further suggest that consciousness emerges when these superpositions collapse in an orchestrated way. Hameroff, being an anesthesiologist, also brought in this idea about anesthesia.
How does anesthesia fit in?
The suggestion is that anesthetics might work by disrupting these very quantum processes, these excitations, within the microtubules.
Ah, okay.
And, some research gets cited in these discussions, findings suggesting quantum vibrations have been detected in microtubules.
Really? Actual vibrations?
Well, detected phenomena interpreted as quantum vibrations, yes.
Yeah.
And findings that anesthetics seem to affect how long these microtubules can sustain these suspected quantum states. Something about delayed luminescence or trapped light re-emission.
Wow.
And also some stuff about anesthetics inhibiting the movement, the diffusion of excited molecules within these tubulin proteins.
So the implication is that something we know directly affects consciousness anesthesia might be interacting with these potential quantum processes at a really fundamental level inside our neurons. That's quite something.
It is quite something. And these kinds of findings are definitely used as points in favor of theories like ORCHOR.
I sense a but coming.
Well, yeah, it's really crucial to understand that the interpretation of these results is heavily debated in the scientific community.
Not everyone agrees these vibrations are quantum or linked to consciousness.
Exactly. Some physicists look at this and say, okay, interesting phenomena, but linking it directly to consciousness, that's a really long shot, is a phrase I saw used. And even interpreting things like the diffusion experiments is complicated. I mean, just classical diffusion in the messy environment of the brain is complex enough.
Right.
And this brings us to a major hurdle for almost all quantum brain theories. Decoherence.
Decoherence, that sounds important.
It is. Decoherence is basically the process where a quantum system loses its quantumness, its superposition, its entanglement, because it interacts with its environment.
So the surrounding environment kind of messes up the delicate quantum state?
You got it. Think of it like the noise and warmth of the brain constantly jostling these delicate quantum states, making them collapse into classical states almost instantly.
So the brain itself, just by being warm and wet and active, might be the worst possible place for these quantum effects to survive long enough to do anything meaningful for consciousness.
That's a central criticism, yes. It's why many scientists are deeply skeptical, sometimes quite dismissive. You hear terms like bullshit or spooky myths.
Okay, strong words.
Often, this strong reaction is also fueled by the way quantum concepts get misused or misapplied outside of physics.
You mean like in self-help or spirituality, quantum healing, and things like that?
Precisely. What's often called quantum mysticism. Sometimes figures like Deepak Chopra are mentioned in this context. The critique is that quantum gets slapped onto ideas without any real basis in the physics.
Right.
The core scientific argument remains. The brain is a macroscopic system. It operates at body temperature, which is relatively high from a quantum perspective. This environment would almost certainly cause extremely rapid decoherence.
Meaning any quantum indeterminacy, any weirdness would likely get washed out immediately.
That's the view. Quantum effects are usually observed under very specific, controlled, often very cold conditions, not in the biological soup of the brain.
It really does sound like a major challenge, like trying to build a delicate ice sculpture in a furnace.
That's a good analogy, yeah. So there's this real divide. On one side, you have people intrigued by the possibility that quantum mechanics holds the key. On the other, those who think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of both quantum physics and neuroscience.
A deep divide.
And just to clarify, this is different from a field called quantum cognition.
Okay, what's that?
Quantum cognition uses the mathematics of quantum probability theory, the formalism, to model how people make decisions or process information.
Ah, so it's using the math as a tool, but not saying the brain is a quantum computer.
Exactly. It doesn't imply quantum mechanics is actually happening physically in the brain to produce thought. It's more about finding that quantum-like math provides good models for certain cognitive biases and judgments.
Interesting distinction. So, okay, the science is clearly complex, debated, far from settled. But let's get back to the conspiracy angle.
Right.
If we were to find out consciousness really does have this fundamental quantum aspect, what are the potential consequences that might make someone believe this information needs to be suppressed?
Yeah, what's the supposed motive for a government cover-up? That's central to the hypothesis. The discussions often point to potentially massive societal and political upheaval if a non-materialistic view of consciousness became widely scientifically validated.
Non-materialistic meaning? Consciousness isn't just the physical brain.
Exactly. If there's something more, maybe a connection to a real realm of pure mind, as some sources put it, or even providing a basis for a soul.
Okay, that would be huge.
Think about the impact on established religions, our understanding of life, death, the afterlife. If science suddenly weighed in definitively on that, it could destabilize existing social and political structures.
Yeah, you can see how that might be perceived as disruptive.
Extremely disruptive. I also saw a discussion around the idea of, well, disappointment. What if consciousness turns out to be just meat in a skin suit?
Ah, the fear of meaninglessness.
Sort of, yeah. It touches on this deep-seated human need, perhaps, to feel special, to have significance beyond just biology.
Our desire for meaning, for purpose.
Exactly. And the suggestion is maybe this inherent desire makes us susceptible to believing in grand conspiracies that offer a more profound, maybe more comforting explanation than just pure materialism.
The thought that our rich inner life, our subjective experience, could just be complex biological clockwork that is unsettling for many people.
It can be. So the potential motivation for concealment in this view could be about maintaining social order, preventing mass panic or existential crises, or maybe preserving certain power structures.
Let's dig into that a bit more. Beyond just general social order, what specific power structures or fears might be threatened if our understanding of consciousness fundamentally changed like this?
Well, one angle is the potential challenge to ideologies, political, economic, that are heavily based on a materialistic view of human nature.
If humans aren't just physical beings, maybe those systems lose some justification.
That could be the fear, yes.
Yeah.
Also, the idea of a realm of pure mind or non-physical consciousness inevitably touches on questions about death.
Right. The afterlife, reincarnation, souls, all that.
And if science seemed to validate something non-physical that persists after death, it could weaken the authority of traditional institutions, like religions or even governments, that currently provide frameworks for understanding these ultimate questions.
It really could send ripples through everything: personal identity, ethics, societal organization, politics, a total paradigm shift.
Potentially, yeah. Which, from the perspective of someone believing in the conspiracy, provides a powerful motive for suppression.
Okay, so we see the potential implications and the suggested motives for a cover-up. Now let's pivot to the other side. What are the main counter-arguments and sources of skepticism against this whole idea?
The biggest counterargument really comes from that mainstream materialist perspective we touched on.
That consciousness is a brain process.
Yes, that it's fundamentally something carried out by the physical system of the brain. And from this view, trying to bring quantum physics into it is often seen as, well, unnecessary or misguided.
Why misguided?
Because consciousness seems to be a high-level emergent phenomenon. Critics argue that looking for its explanation at the ultra-granular level of quantum mechanics might be looking in the wrong place entirely, like trying to understand traffic patterns by studying quarks in the asphalt.
Okay, the levels might be mismatched. I remember seeing an analogy about a radio.
Ah, yes, the radio analogy. That's often used. Can you unpack that?
Sure. The idea is, a radio receiver is necessary to hear the radio show. If you damage the radio, the show gets distorted or stops.
Right. Correlation between the hardware and the output.
Exactly. But the radio isn't the show. The show isn't generated solely by the radio's components. It's broadcast from elsewhere. The radio receives and translates it. So the analogy suggests that while brain activity clearly correlates with consciousness and brain damage affects consciousness, that doesn't automatically prove the brain creates consciousness or that consciousness is identical to brain activity. Maybe the brain is more like a receiver or facilitator.
It's a useful way to frame the debate about correlation versus causation, or identity, yeah. But materialists would counter that. Unlike a radio signal, we have no evidence of consciousness existing independently of a functioning brain.
A fair counterpoint. What about the argument that quantum mechanics is just so weird? Maybe its weirdness is needed to explain the weirdness of consciousness.
Skeptics push back hard on that, too. They argue that just because quantum physics describes counterintuitive phenomena doesn't mean it magically solves the hard problem of consciousness.
The hard problem being, why do we feel anything? Why is there subjective experience?
Exactly. Why does it feel like something to be you? The weirdness of quantum mechanics superposition entanglement doesn't in itself explain the emergence of subjective feeling, of qualia.
So invoking quantum mechanics isn't necessarily an explanation. It might just be swapping one mystery for another.
That's the critique. Plus, some argue consciousness is really more a question for biology, neuroscience, maybe philosophy, rather than fundamental physics.
And I think you mentioned earlier, sometimes classical systems can mimic quantum effects.
Yes, that's another point raised. Some seemingly quantum phenomena can apparently be reproduced using purely classical systems. And also, the other way around, predictable, deterministic classical behavior often emerges from underlying quantum indeterminacy at larger scales.
So the quantum randomness might just average out.
It often does, yes. And then there's the whole issue of how the term quantum gets misused in these discussions.
We touched on that with quantum mysticism.
Right. It gets thrown around very loosely, attached to concepts like good energy or higher frequencies in ways that have absolutely no connection to actual quantum physics. It becomes a sort of buzzword that sounds scientific, but is often meaningless in context.
Which understandably frustrates scientists.
Understandably. And finally, from a critical thinking standpoint, we have to be aware of the logical fallacies often associated with conspiracy theories in general, confirmation bias, appeal to mystery, assuming correlation implies causation.
So a healthy dose of skepticism is warranted just based on the nature of the claim itself.
Absolutely. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Which brings us neatly to the evidence itself. What is actually presented?
Well, one experiment that comes up again and again in these online discussions is the double slit experiment.
Ah, yes. The classic.
Can you explain why it's so often cited and perhaps why that might be a misinterpretation in this context?
Sure. The double slit experiment is fundamental because it beautifully demonstrates wave-particle duality, how quantum objects like electrons can behave like both waves and particles.
And the observation part.
Crucially, it shows that if you try to detect which slit the particle goes through, its behavior changes. It stops acting like a spread-out wave and acts like a localized particle, losing the interference pattern you'd otherwise see.
And this gets linked to consciousness. How?
The leap often made is that the act of conscious observation is what forces the particle to choose a state, collapsing its wave function. People connect the observer in the experiment to a conscious mind influencing reality.
But that's not the standard physics interpretation, right?
Not at all. In physics, the observer or measurement doesn't require consciousness. Any interaction with a measuring device, or even just interaction with the environment that reveals which path information, is enough to destroy the wave-like interference pattern and cause decoherence.
So it's the physical interaction, the measurement itself, not necessarily a mind looking at it.
Exactly. A Geiger counter, a photon detector, even stray air molecules bumping into the particle. Any interaction that extracts information about its path can act as a measurement in this sense. Invoking consciousness is an extra step that's not needed by the physics.
Okay, that's a really important clarification. What other bits of evidence are sometimes brought up?
Well, sometimes research on, believe it or not, bird brains gets mentioned.
Bird brains. How?
Specifically, research into how some birds navigate using the Earth's magnetic field. There's evidence suggesting this involves quantum effects specifically, magnetically sensitive chemical reactions involving entangled electrons and proteins in the bird's eye.
Quantum entanglement helping birds find their way. That's pretty cool.
It is cool. But linking that specific biological quantum sensor in birds to the general nature of human consciousness, and then further leaping to an intentional government conspiracy about it.
Yeah, that feels like several very large leaps indeed. It doesn't seem directly relevant.
It's quite a stretch, yes.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we come back to the microtubule research we discussed earlier.
The Orchar-related stuff. Vibrations, anesthetic effects.
Right. Those studies claiming quantum vibrations or showing anesthetic effects on light emission and diffusion in microtubules. As we said, while interesting, these findings are very much debated.
And crucially, even if those interpretations favoring quantum effects in microtubules turn out to be correct.
Even then, there's still no direct, verifiable evidence presented in the material we looked at that points to a government conspiracy to deliberately conceal this information. That link remains entirely speculative.
Right. There's a gap between maybe quantum effects happen in the brain and governments are actively hiding this.
A very significant gap, yeah.
So, after digging into all of this, the theories, the critiques, the supposed evidence, the motivations, what are the main takeaways for you? Where does this leave us on the quantum consciousness conspiracy hypothesis?
Well, it's clear this whole area is incredibly complex. You've got this fascinating mix of frontier science in both quantum physics and neuroscience, deep philosophical questions about the nature of reality and mind, and layered on top, these very human desires for meaning and perhaps a distrust of authority. The idea of a quantum basis for consciousness definitely has an allure. It taps into the mysteries of both the quantum world and our own subjective experience. But based on the discussions and perspectives we've explored here, there's just no solid, concrete evidence presented for a deliberate, orchestrated government cover-up. The conspiracy part of the hypothesis remains unsubstantiated.
It really seems to highlight our ongoing struggle, doesn't it? The struggle to understand what consciousness actually is, and maybe the temptation to seek profound answers in revolutionary, sometimes counterintuitive fields like quantum mechanics.
Absolutely. And that temptation makes it even more crucial, I think, to maintain a clear distinction between rigorous scientific investigation, which is ongoing and exciting, and speculative interpretations that leap into unsubstantiated conspiracy claims.
The burden of proof remains high.
Extremely high, especially for claims this extraordinary. So this deep dive really leaves you, the listener, with questions, I think. Questions about what constitutes good evidence, how we should evaluate claims that challenge mainstream views, and maybe even the psychological factors that draw people to these kinds of grand narratives.
It definitely encourages further exploration, but with a critical eye,
Yeah.
looking into the actual science of quantum mechanics, the neuroscience of consciousness, but maybe separating that from the conspiracy overlay unless real evidence emerges.
Precisely. Approach it with curiosity, but also with discernment.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.